but still I'm just giving a basic introduction. He's the current president of one of the non-profit foundation, the Foundation for Economic Education in Atlanta, US. And earlier, before that, he was very much into the public policy uh, initiatives. He was behind many of the state government and local government good policy initiatives. Uh, well, when it comes to the academic perspective, he has a doctorate in public administration. So, as most of us are aspiring bureaucrats or civil servants and politicians, some of you, this particular approach, his insights into public administration, effective public administration is very, very, very important. I feel every one of you will benefit greatly from this. And apart from that, his education, his insights onto various hyperinflation aspects or the black markets, how do they develop, and various other issues. And most importantly, if you have browsed about Larry, just basic browsing will let you know the entire um, contributions given by him. His one of the best insight that I feel is about his civilizational parallels between. He was trying to compare the modern civilization with the ancient Rome. How was ancient Rome uh, met its last stage, and he tried to compare the cultural values which will be more or less similar in the modern civilization. So I wish every one of you will immensely benefit from this session. Uh, watch more videos of Larry. So I wish all the very best for every one of you, and I'm just handing over the session to Larry. Thank you.
Thank you, Theja, and thank you, ladies and gentlemen in India. I take it from all over India for tuning in today. I appreciate it very much. And if you were one of those that we disappointed yesterday with connection problems, my apologies, but I'm glad that we were able to put it together today, and it's a pleasure and an honor to be with you. Before I get into my talk, I just wanted to tell you that if you haven't had a chance yet to visit the website of the organization of which I'm President Emeritus, FEE, Foundation for Economic Education, I would certainly like you to visit it at your leisure. The website is fee.org. And I also have a public figure Facebook page I would invite you to like, as well as a personal website, lawrencewreed.com. Theja has asked me to talk to you about the Great Depression. And of course, my knowledge of the Great Depression as an economist and historian is pretty exclusively focused on the American experience, although it was truly a worldwide phenomenon. But let me focus on why it happened in America, and I'll leave it to you in India to see if it may have some parallels or if it strikes a chord in some way from your knowledge of that time period, the 1930s. I think the Great Depression is best explained not as one big, long, 12-year or even 16-year depression, but rather as four distinct phases of a Great Depression. And that's the way I would like to present it to you today. The first phase will explain why it started, and the second, third, and fourth phases will explain why it persisted, why it didn't go away, and in fact, for a time, why it even got worse. Surely, in American history, we've had no experience more traumatic economically than we had during the 1930s Great Depression. At one point, the unemployment rate was way up in the 20s, 28, 27%, thereabouts. Half of industrial production was idle. There was a great deal of despair and hopelessness, and a lot of Americans wondered if we would ever recover. So it was a very awful episode in our history. And I should point out, though, it was not the first depression in American history. We'd had others before, but all of the previous ones were over in 1 year, 2 or 3 or 3.5 years. The Great Depression lasted at least 4 times longer than any previous depression. It began in 1929, as you'll see in a moment when I explain the first phase of it. And it ended, some people say, in 1941. That would be a 12-year depression. But I think a better case can be made that it didn't end until after World War II in 1945, which makes it a 16-year experience. More on that as we get into the talk. So what is the first phase of the Great Depression? The first phase, as each of the others do, has a name. Well, by the way, some of you may want to put yourself on mute when you come on, because okay, thank you. The first phase is the phase we call the monetary or financial phase of the Great Depression, because it has a lot to do with what was happening to the money and credit supply. From 1924 until late 1928, the United States Central Bank, of course, that's the Federal Reserve System, engineered a substantial expansion of money and credit. Now, there is disagreement among economists as to how substantial that money and credit expansion was. The economist Murray Rothbard argued that by one key measure of money and credit, the supply increased by some 66% in that approximately 5-year period. That would be pretty substantial by any means. Others say, no, it wasn't quite that radical, but everybody can agree, I think, who looks at these numbers, that whatever the rate of expansion of money and credit was by the Federal Reserve and the banking system under their direction, it was enough to drive interest rates to historic lows. It was enough to give us what we call the roaring 20s, a booming economy. Now, there were some good things happening in the 1920s too, that helped to spur economic growth. The primary good thing was the tax reduction, or substantial and repeated tax reductions of the Harding and Coolidge administrations. President Harding died in 1923 in August. He was succeeded by his vice president, Calvin Coolidge. The two of them together were big believers in reduction in taxes. When they came to office in 1921, they found that the top income tax rate in America was already, not even a decade into the income tax, was in the 70 percentile range. And so they said that's driving too many people overseas or into sterile investments, and we're going to cut tax rates. And they did by some 2/3. The top rate was eventually brought down into the 20s under Calvin Coolidge. And in fact, this was a period of substantial government surpluses in the federal budget, a reduction in the national debt. Those were all good things. They helped to spur real economic growth. But the bad thing that was happening that would sooner or later cause a day of reckoning was this expansion of money and credit by the Federal Reserve. It was stimulating, to some degree, a false artificial boom, a bubble, if you will. And when the Federal Reserve reversed itself, as it did beginning in late 28 and into early 29, and began to raise interest rates, that bubble would be pricked, and the result would be an economic crash. Now, some people say, well, didn't the Great Depression begin in October of 1929, when the stock market staged such a dramatic collapse? October 24 of 1929 is known in our history as Black Thursday. Huge losses on Wall Street. And I think it's a mistake to say that was the start of the Depression. It's important to notice that the stock market had been declining for a couple of months before that big crash in late October. And that was because the smart money, the investors who really looked at behind the scenes information like changes in monetary policy, they began to notice in early 29 that the Federal Reserve had reversed itself. They noticed that instead of dirt cheap interest rates and easy money, the Fed was now moving in the other direction, raising interest rates, choking off the growth of the money supply. And they knew then that the party was soon to be over. And so they began selling in the summer of 1929, and that caused the stock market to slow down its rise and then to flatten out and begin to decline. And there were some really bad days well before October 24. It was in late October when the masses of investors realized, wow, policies have changed big time. Interest rates are going through the roof. It's time to sell. And when they stampeded, when great numbers of people stampeded out of the market, that's when you had the stock crash. But it didn't cause the depression. It was a symptom. It was a reflection of this dramatic change in money supply. Now, if nothing else had happened, maybe by the spring of 1930, a few months later, perhaps we could have seen a recovery. And this would have gone down in history as just one of many corrections in the stock market. In fact, as late as May of 1930, we didn't have a depression yet. We only had a recession. Unemployment was about 8.5% or so. That's recessionary. It's troublesome, but it isn't certainly not a Great Depression yet. Well, that brings us then to the second phase of the Great Depression. The second phase, which I'll give you the name of in just a moment, it is what took a recession and very quickly made it a depression. Again, keep in mind, in May and June of 1930, we weren't in a depression yet. But unemployment had risen and the politicians took notice. The stock market, which had crashed the previous October, as I mentioned, it had already rebounded and regained half of the losses of the fall of 1929. So there were some good signs that perhaps recovery was soon to happen. But in June of 1930, we have the beginning of the second phase. And the name of the second phase is the disintegration of the world economy. Here's what happened. I have to explain a little bit of the political and economic backdrop so you know why this happened in June of 1930. At that time, the Republican Party controlled the White House and both houses of Congress. And in those days, going back, in fact, into the 19th century, the Republican Party was historically the high tariff party, the protectionist party. The Democratic Party, historically, had been the free trade party. That difference today is a little bit blurred, and there are plenty of protectionists in both parties, free traders in both. It's not as distinct, maybe, as it was back then. But the Republicans, facing congressional elections in the fall of 1930, realized they'd better do something with unemployment in the 8 to 9% range. And so they crafted, and President Herbert Hoover signed into law, the famous Smoot-Hawley Tariff in June of 1930. Smoot-Hawley. It raised tariffs on foreign goods to an all-time high and virtually closed the border. Now, the idea there was that these protectionists, some in the Democratic Party, but mostly in the Republican Party at that time, they thought, well, if we raise tariffs on foreign goods, that will make them so expensive that Americans will stop buying them, and instead they'll buy goods made at home. And that will put those unemployed people back to work. That was the thinking, but it was very flawed, mistaken thinking. You cannot close the door to imports without sooner or later closing the door to exports. And that's true even if foreign governments don't retaliate, but they did, which made the situation even worse. A lot of foreign governments said, okay, if you're going to raise taxes on our goods, we're going to raise taxes on your goods. And so Smoot-Hawley proved to be a catalyst for a collapse in world trade through a trade war, through protectionist devices like the tariff. Well, that meant that if you were in a business that sold much of its production to, say, foreign markets, you got really hit hard. Now, you might be thinking, well, how could an industry that is selling abroad, an American industry selling overseas, how could that be hurt by tariffs on goods coming from another country? Again, you cut off the door, or close the door to imports, you will close the door to exports. And that's because if foreigners cannot sell here because of our high tariffs, they can't buy here. If the ship never comes from Japan with, say, automobiles, it never goes back with boatloads of wheat and corn and soybeans and other things that the Japanese might have bought in the American markets. In fact, at the time, agriculture was a very important export industry, still is in America. About a third of what American farmers in 1930 were producing was being sold in overseas markets. But all of a sudden, with the signing of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff, much of that foreign market was lost. Farmers found, foreigners can't afford to buy our goods now because we've made their goods too unaffordable to Americans. We can't sell to them because we won't let them sell to us because of our high tariffs. So American agriculture instantly went into a tailspin. And in America, I don't know if you had such images in India at that time or not, but in America, old timers still can remember pictures of farmers killing off huge flocks of baby chicks because it didn't pay to raise them to maturity because prices plummeted, which is, of course, to be expected. If you reduce your market by a third, you're suddenly glutted with all this production that can't be sold. And so farmers were killing off baby animals. It was too expensive to raise them to maturity for the price you could get. They were dumping milk into ditches for the same reason. And then because farmers went bankrupt by the thousands, that meant that the banks in the rural areas of America also went bankrupt. They were the banks that held the mortgages, the farm mortgages. And with farmers unable to pay, the banks went under too. Thousands of banks in America went out of business in the 1930s. And overwhelmingly, they were in the rural areas, not in big cities. Another reason for this is, by the way, the fact that we had stupid laws on the books that made it illegal for banks to have branches, sometimes even in neighboring states, let alone states far away. It was called the unit banking rule. So that meant that so many banks were confined in terms of where they could draw deposits and where they could make investments in their immediate locale. And so that lacking diversity, they were very vulnerable to their local economy suffering from something like Smoot-Hawley. So that helped to drag banks down too. Canada at the same time, Canada had a Great Depression when we did too, but not a single bank in all of Canada ever failed during the entire decade of the 1930s. And why? I think it's because of this crazy unit banking rule that we had in the United States that prevented banks from diversifying and putting and forced them in effect to put all their eggs in one basket. Canada didn't have that, and so it didn't have the bank failures that we did, and its recovery from depression was quicker than ours. So world trade ground to a halt because of the Smoot-Hawley Tariff of June of 1930. A trade war spread throughout the world, hurting industries like agriculture that were so dependent upon international trade. Now, before I get to the third phase, there's something else I have to tell you that happens chronologically within this second phase. It isn't related to the world economy, but it's a very important factor. It happens in 1932, okay? We are well into a great deep depression by 1932. The Smoot-Hawley Tariff and the Federal Reserve's continued contraction of the money supply assured that prices would continue tumbling, incomes and employment continued to fall. And by 1932, unemployment was well above 20%. Well, you can imagine what that did to the federal budget in Washington. With people not working and with businesses failing, income or revenue to the federal government declined dramatically. But under Herbert Hoover, who is mistakenly viewed in history as a laissez-faire, hands-off, do-nothing president, he was quite the opposite. He was all over the place with massive spending and subsidies and bailouts and higher tariffs and so forth. But nonetheless, in 1932, with this big deficit in the federal budget causing concern, Herbert Hoover made things even worse when, along with the Congress, of course, he signed into law the Revenue Act of 1932. Guess what it did? In the midst of a depression, the Revenue Act of 1932 doubled the income tax. In fact, at the high or top rate, highest levels of income, it was more than a doubling, from some 24% all the way up to 65%. So that meant that if you weren't already flattened by Smoot-Hawley and other interventions by government, if you were still lucky enough to make a few dollars and have your business still open, now you really got socked because the government was coming in and doubling your income tax. That is the most ridiculous thing. What they should have done is to cut their spending to meet the shortfall in revenue, but instead they flattened an already sick economy with a doubling of the income tax. So here we are in the fall of 1932 with a Great Depression on our hands, and we have a presidential election. Herbert Hoover, the president of the United States at that time and a Republican, ran for re-election. I don't see how he could ever have won given the conditions. But his opponent in that contest was, of course, the Democrat nominee, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who had been governor of New York. In that campaign, if you believed in less government, if you thought, as I do, that government was the source of the problem, then you would have voted for Franklin Roosevelt. Why? Because Roosevelt ran on a platform that attacked Hoover for expanding government. In fact, the platform of the Democratic Party on which Roosevelt ran in 1932 called for a 25% reduction in federal spending. Roosevelt attacked Hoover for, and these are his own words, presiding over the greatest taxing and spending administration in American history. And he was right. His running mate for vice president, John Nance Garner of Texas, attacked Hoover for, quote, leading the country down the path to socialism. Can you imagine that? I mean, they were right in this regard because they were pointing out that Hoover had raised taxes, he had raised tariffs, he was spending like crazy, he was bailing out businesses. He was all over the place. He wasn't a laissez-faire president at all. But the problem is that upon election, which they won in a landslide in November of 1932, Roosevelt and his running mate, once they took office, had no intention of fulfilling those promises and delivering less government. They did just the opposite. In fact, in his first term, Roosevelt doubled federal spending and raised taxes. And now this leads me to the third phase of the Great Depression. And the phase of the third phase is called the phase of the New Deal, the New Deal. That's, of course, a very famous phrase, New Deal, to describe the package of legislation that Franklin Roosevelt, as president, pushed through the Congress in his first 100 days as president, which began in March of 1933. Now, what were these New Deal measures? Let me tell you about the two biggest ones, okay? Because they were the centerpieces of his plan and the ones that had the greatest impact on the economy. The first act of two that I'll mention of this third phase was the NIRA, National Industrial Recovery Act. The idea behind it was, according to Roosevelt and his close advisors, that there was too much competition in the economy. First of all, they noticed that prices were tumbling, especially for agricultural goods. Well, of course they were. You have the Federal Reserve continuing to contract the money supply. You have Smoot-Hawley wiping out markets. So of course you have falling prices. And the Roosevelt people noticed that every time a businessman or a farmer raised his price a little bit to get a little more money, then somebody else would come along and undercut it with a lower price. So they said, what we've got to do is to get everybody to raise their prices. And so the NIRA created a new bureaucracy called the NRA, the National Recovery Administration. And its job was to impose price controls throughout the economy, codes and regulations and price fixing, all intended to keep prices from falling and to try to get them actually to go up. There was a famous case involving a New Jersey man. He was a tailor who mended clothes and so forth. His name was Jack Megan, and he was prosecuted under the NIRA because he pressed a suit of clothes for 35 cents instead of the official government mandated price of 40 cents. Now think of this. This is a classic example of the NIRA at work. We're in the midst of the Great Depression. You're lucky if you even have a suit of clothes to get pressed at the cleaners. And you take it to this guy, Jack Megan, and he says, sure, I'll press your clothes for you for 35 cents. And then he gets sentenced to jail because he didn't charge you 40 cents. Now, how was that supposed to cause economic recovery? I mean, one man's price is another man's cost. And so even if it had helped Jack Megan get a little bit more, he probably would have had less business. But to put him in jail because he charged freely a price the government didn't mandate is just absolutely ridiculous. But yet this is what the government was doing. The effect of the NIRA was to dramatically raise the costs of doing business across America and to dramatically increase bankruptcies and unemployment. But if you think that was bad enough, oh my gosh, the other main centerpiece of the New Deal was the AAA. The Agricultural Adjustment Act. The AAA was aimed at agriculture. Roosevelt's people said, look, agriculture is in a terrible shape. And of course it was, for reasons I've just mentioned. Contraction of the money supply, Smoot-Hawley, and so forth. So they decided to impose a new tax. This is what the AAA did. A new tax on agriculture, just what a depressed industry needs, right? And use the money to pay for the destruction of perfectly good fields of corn, wheat, and soybeans, and the destruction of perfectly healthy cattle, sheep, and pigs. You had, in the case of one particular order from the Agriculture Secretary, Henry Wallace, to destroy 6 million baby pigs throughout the United States, in just one of many of these crazy orders. You had federal tax-paying farmers now seeing their money go to destroy their own crops. There was a farmer who testified in Washington about this, saying how he used to teach his mules to walk between the rows so as to not trample the crops. But now with the AAA, he had to teach the mule to trample on the crops. And he couldn't get the mule to do it. The mule was smart enough not to destroy the crops that the politicians thought we should destroy. Even if this had helped the farmers, it could have done so only at the expense of everybody else. This is a redistribution scheme through destruction, not a prescription for economic recovery. Well, the American economy not only didn't recover from this, we wouldn't see substantial recovery until we got rid of these two acts, which the Supreme Court did over the next couple of years. The Supreme Court ultimately declared both of those things unconstitutional. And partly because of that, getting rid of the worst of FDR, the court helped to give us some economic renewal in 1936 and 37. The economy started to turn upward again, although it was a far cry from normalcy. In 1937, however, we saw the swiftest collapse in economic history in America. We had a depression within a depression. What causes this? Oh my gosh, 1937, we're just barely starting to see light at the end of the tunnel, and the American economy collapses again. Roosevelt achieves a first, a depression within a depression. This brings me now to the fourth phase of the depression, the phase of the Wagner Act, W-A-G-N-E-R. This begins in 1937, and it explains the collapse in that year of the American economy. The Wagner Act is the main reason why things fell apart in 37. But first, let me tell you, there were a couple of other things too. One was higher taxes. Roosevelt won re-election in 1936. You have to give him credit. Nothing was working. We were still in depression, but the American people voted him back in. He was running against a guy that the Republicans put up who was just a kind of milquetoast candidate from Kansas who said, hey, I'll do pretty much what he's doing. I'll just somehow do it better. That didn't inspire confidence. And Roosevelt gave great fireside chats, you know, over the radio. A lot of people thought, oh, he sounds like he's trying to help us. So they voted him back in. But when he resumed his presidency with his second term, he decided we got to raise taxes. Let's raise taxes on undistributed profits. That is profits that companies choose not to give to their shareholders, but instead to plow back into the business for growth and expansion. He wanted to get the money into the pockets of the shareholders. So Roosevelt said, don't you hold on to your profits, even though that's an important source of investment and economic growth. So he wanted to tax them at the rate of 85%. Congress didn't give him one that high. It was more on the order of 35%, but it was still very destructive. And fortunately, Congress realized the harm it was doing, and it repealed that within a couple of years. But it was very harmful in 1937. Roosevelt, by the way, looked for every chance he could to raise taxes, even in the midst of the Depression. He campaigned in 1932 against Hoover, in part because he said that Hoover was raising taxes and Roosevelt said he wouldn't do that. Well, before he's done, he'll have the top tax rate up at 91%. And there was a time when Roosevelt actually proposed a 100% tax rate on all incomes in excess of $25,000. Can you imagine that? A 100% tax rate on all incomes over $25,000. Why would anybody take a risk, employ another person, expand his factory, or stay in America if he wanted to make a few bucks, when the government says, don't make anything more than $25,000 because if you do, we'll take every penny of it over that amount. That was not a prescription for renewed confidence or investment, and that was a factor. Those kinds of things were factors in the 1937 collapse. But it's the Wagner Act for which the fourth phase gets its name because it was most destructive. This was also formerly known as the National Labor Relations Act. It created a body of labor law that we are still in America governed by today. It created the National Labor Relations Board, appointed by the president, to adjudicate disputes between labor and management. It took labor issues out of the ordinary courts of law and put them in the hands of a presidentially appointed body. It also gave enormous new powers to labor unions, made it easier to organize. This was the beginning of mandatory, compulsory, collective bargaining, exclusive representation at labor sites by unions. Unions went on an organizing spree and a spree of strikes all across the country in 1937 and 38, shutting down factories and swiftly causing economic harm from coast to coast. The number of man hours lost just to strikes in only the first year of the Wagner Act more than doubled, from 14 million lost man hours to 28 million a year later. This was why 1937's collapse happened. Now, we will linger in depression for a number of additional years. people say today, oh, well, yeah, the Depression was still on, but it ended when the war began, when America entered the Second World War. It's true that in 1941, 42, we entered the war, of course, in December of 41. It's true that unemployment, the official rate, certainly fell dramatically in 1942 and 43. A large reason for that is that we drafted 11 million men and sent them overseas. So they didn't count in the unemployment numbers anymore. And American industry now was had switched from consumer goods to a great extent and now was producing war material that the government was purchasing. So unemployment officially declines, but the reason I think it's not quite accurate to say the Depression was over, I think it wasn't over until about 1945, is because these standards of living of the typical American did not rise during World War II. In fact, by many measures, it actually fell. After all, just think of it, what was happening? Resources that might otherwise have gone to the production of refrigerators and automobiles and consumer goods were being diverted to the production of war material. Now, arguably, that had to be done in order to win the war, but that's not the same as saying it produced economic recovery. We were making things to blow things up. We were not making things for personal consumption. So Americans had to cut back. They were, many goods were rationed. And so I don't think you can say there was a substantial, real improvement for the average American in his or her standard of living until after World War II. One last thing before we go to questions. What did cause ultimate recovery in 1945 and 46? A lot of people, you know, if you're a Keynesian economist, if you were at that time, you were one of the people typically saying, oh my gosh, America after the war will fall back into depression because government spending will decline. And it did. We had the biggest reduction in US government spending in American history after World War II, mainly because of the demobilization after victory in World War II. Well, contrary to the Keynesian myth, that reduction in government spending didn't give us a depression. It actually freed up resources for use in the far more efficient and productive private sector. A lot of things now that were being sent off to war to blow things up and were blown up themselves now can be used in the production of consumer goods. And people can go back to work in factories making refrigerators and cars and so forth. That was a big reason for the recovery. We stopped blowing things up and producing things for war. We cut federal spending. The other big reason for recovery in 45 and 46 was that Franklin Roosevelt was gone. And his endless attacks on private enterprise were gone with it. Harry Truman was in some ways a better president. He wasn't as divisive and anti-enterprise as Roosevelt was. And he was talked into by the Congress supporting a substantial reduction in 1945 in the corporate income tax. It went overnight. The corporate income tax went from 90% to, I think it was 25 or 35% overnight. Now you can put yourself in the position of a private businessman. On one day, the government says, we might take as much as 90% of your income if you expand a plant or build a factory. And the next day it says, nope, the most we'll take is 35%. That's going to affect your behavior. You're going to have more, not only more reason to be confident, you're going to have more resources to invest. And that's exactly what American enterprise did. Plus, there was a great demand now from Europe to buy things that only America could supply because their own factories had been blown up. So anybody who can look back on this history and with the tax hikes and the radical interventions, the crazy monetary policy of the federal government, the crushing of world trade through high tariffs, all these crazy interventions I talked about, he who can look at that and still say the Great Depression was caused by the free market or by capitalism is just terribly uninformed. That's not what happened at all. This was a failure of government intervention. Thank you, and Thaja, I'm ready if you are for questions.
So before I ask certain questions that I collected, I would like the participants, if any of you are willing to ask some question, you can unmute yourself and you can ask.
Hi Larry, this is Anil. I hope you and your family too good. I have a small doubt here. See, instead of raising taxes to control depression, is there any alternative way or alternative measures to control depression and overcome this?
Yes, that very good question. Instead of raising taxes, might there have been other ways to fix the problem? Well, yeah, raising taxes was probably one of the worst ways because it directly hit you in the pocketbook, which you were struggling to fill or to keep from being empty. My personal argument would have been similar to what Roosevelt himself made in 1932, cut government spending. Roosevelt himself said Herbert Hoover was spending too much. That would have certainly helped. Now, if in fact there was still a deficit in the federal budget, it would have had to be financed through borrowing. Borrowing is less objectionable if in fact you're quick to pay it back rather than just add it to the national debt and never try to take care of it. If you do what Calvin Coolidge did in the 1920s and try to pay off the debt as quickly as you can. But politicians usually don't do that. It's a rare one, like Coolidge, that tries to reduce the debt. So if instead of raising taxes, they had simply relied on borrowing to try to make up the difference, I'm afraid that the Roosevelt administration would have just squandered the income from that. So I think the best solution would have been to cut spending and repeal the Smoot-Hawley Tariff so as to revive world trade. Maybe endure a couple of years of budget deficits, but then see revenues turn around by a healthier economy. But instead, what they did was to make the economy unhealthy for more than a decade and make the deficits for a period of time even bigger.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So I would like to make a point here. What do you think about the current interest rates? Similarly, the kind of credit expansion we see in 1930s, is it too low?
Yes.
Currently?
Thanks, Thaja. Yeah, that's a very good question. Yeah, I am concerned that there are parallels. Anytime the federal government, through its central bank, artificially depresses interest rates, you potentially create a rebound or a reaction situation in the economy. In the short run, low interest rates seem like, wow, isn't that terrific? People can borrow at cheaper rates. What's wrong with that? But usually that sets into motion a correction at some point. Either the market itself, when it sees higher rates of price inflation, will cause interest rates to adjust upward, or the Federal Reserve itself will get frightened of its own actions and reverse itself, as it did in the 1930s. I don't know when that might, which and when that might happen, but I think if you only look at the short run effects of massive expansion of money and credit, the low interest rates, if only you do is look at the short run effects of that, you could be fooled into thinking that this is somehow a good thing to do, but it's not sustainable. At some point when those rates rise, the people who were dependent upon the lower rates are going to be especially hard hit. And many of the businesses that had planned according to interest rates staying low will find themselves in very difficult straits. That's when you then get the correction phase. It's sort of like if a man goes to a party and drinks like a fish. For the first few hours after that, he's having a great time. Wow, yeah, I feel great, give me more. And then the next day, of course, as that wears off, he has the hangover phase. That's the high interest rate phase of the cycle. And if you come upon a man who's suffering the hangover phase after a night of drinking, you don't say to him, oh, let me help you. Here's another bottle. Instead, you say, oh my gosh, you did the damage last night. You're only feeling it now, but the damage was done when you thought you were having a good time. Don't do that again. You're just going to have to dry out. So anyway, I hope that answers the question.
The next question, what exactly do you think the current phase of recession that's going on? In which phase do you link it to 1930s?
Well, excuse me, every cycle is very different, accompanied by very different actions of the authorities and so forth. The present downturn is not really of a cyclical nature like the Great Depression was. This is a very unusual event sparked by the virus. Right before the virus hit, in fact, we were still in the boom phase of the cycle. And my guess is that this new round of even lower interest rates and easy money and the gradual lifting of the lockdowns will probably cause the economy to resume its growth. But I do worry about how lasting that may be, because the Federal Reserve is going to have an immediate problem of what's it going to do with all that money sloshing around out there that it forced into the economy during a time of crisis. It may give it a short-term lift, but what's it going to do in the longer run? I'm afraid, for instance, that we'll start to see higher rates of price inflation, maybe by the end of this year. And then the Fed will have to confront the problem of how do we try to wind down the purchases of all the securities we bought, all the easy money we flooded the economy with, without prompting interest rates to soar and nip it all in the bud. That's going to be a very difficult thing to do. So ultimately, I think it's going to take time to look back and say, or render a meaningful assessment on what the Federal Reserve and the US government did to fight this virus. I think it's just going to accentuate the boom bust phase of the economy. We just got another massive dose of easy money, at the same time a big reduction in the supply of goods. That's a prescription for higher prices, and the Fed will invariably try to combat that at some point by jacking interest rates up and pushing the economy into a corrective recession, hopefully not worse than a recession, but that's only a matter of time.
Okay, so related to the lockdown, some of the countries, after easing down the lockdown rules, the cases of infection is a bit rising, whether it is West or in India or other countries. So in which case, again, many of the policymakers or the governments are pitching for reintroduction of the strict lockdown, especially 2 days back or yesterday in one of the metro city in India, they have again reimposed a complete lockdown, strict lockdown. So what kind of implications will it have on the future economy or even about the virus things?
Oh, I think a resumption of strict lockdowns will have terrible effects. It will be a second blow. It will prompt many small businesses to not just shut down, but to close down and for good. I have so little confidence in how the governments of the world have responded in this first wave of the virus that I can't get myself to have much confidence in how they may respond if there's a rebound or a second wave. I think in hindsight, it seems to me that the lockdowns did probably more harm than good, and that if the government had done the right thing, it would have encouraged a focus on the most vulnerable of the population, like elderly people, and pretty much otherwise left the economy alone. So I'm not so sure in the end that its strategy in the last 4 months has been effective. So I don't have any confidence really that it would be effective in the future. I think you've got to reopen economies and encourage people to, hey, stay at home if you're elderly, if you have underlying health issues that make you more vulnerable. Still, there's going to be risk. That's the nature of pandemics. But you can't shut down an economy with all of its negative implications, including massive rates of increases in things like suicide. You can't shut down an economy and be blind to the very personal, devastating effects of that.
There was a question from the participant. So should I ask for?
Yeah, I saw it come up on the screen and disappear.
Yeah.
If you see it?
How decreasing government spending will influence the credit system, taking the case of high stagflation, low industrial output because of low demand. To stimulate demand, expansionary policies could help. Here, expansionary policies, he was trying to intend about the Keynesian and fiscal policies as well as monetary expansionist policies, like government spending as well as the central bank's easy money approach.
Here's the eternal problem in economics, and you see it recur time and again when we talk about short-term versus long-term, or what do we do now and what might be the effects of that down the road. There's always, naturally and unfortunately, an excessive emphasis on the short term. Oh, let's spend today because we have a crisis today. But the problem is that if that in the long run creates even worse problems for yourself or other people or even future generations, you might want to have a second thought. So these proposals for more expansionary spending today, I fear that's just trying to fix something with a short-term solution that may bring with it even worse long-term problems. That's like going to the man in The Hangover and saying, oh, well, here's a short-term solution for you. Here's another bottle. Take another swig. Just get yourself drunk again. But that's not a long-term answer. He's doing permanent damage to himself when he does that. He needs to ride it out and dry out and reestablish his constitution from a sound basis, not things like getting drunk again. That's what worries me, that this expansionary stuff is purely short-term. It pleases the crowd for the moment, but then it sets them up for another correction and difficulties down the road. When are we going to get off this crazy merry-go-round or roller coaster by doing the right thing instead of what seems to be beneficial only in the short run? So yeah, short-term expansionary government spending through and creation of money can give certain sectors a lift, but it's always at the expense of distortions and a future correction. And the more of that you do today, the greater the correction is likely to be at a later date.
So another question from Talik. Is there any chance we will return to the gold standard?
Oh, any chance we might return to the gold standard? Well, it seems very remote right now. Let me say that I'm a big fan of the gold standard in history. I think it served well as our money. When we departed from it, we gave an increasingly blank check to politicians to ruin our money. In fact, in America, you think back to the creation of the Federal Reserve, our central bank in 1913. We were told then that we need to make this somewhat of a departure from the gold standard. You know, we still had gold convertibility, but we now wanted to give government massive new abilities to expand and create money. We were told that by creating the Federal Reserve, we could iron out the business cycle. We could protect the integrity of the dollar. We could insert some flexibility into the economy, all those kinds of terms politicians like to use, and encourage full employment and things like that. Well, here we are a century later, and what have been the results? Under the Federal Reserve System, we've had one Great Depression, which I explained to you was triggered by the Federal Reserve. We've had 8 or 9 or 10 recessions, mostly triggered by the same kind of activity, easy money followed by tight money, erratic monetary policy. And we have a dollar that's worth about a nickel of what it was when the Federal Reserve started. So that's not a very good track record. If we had put some private entity in charge of our money and said, here, you manage our money supply, and if its performance was that bad, I think there'd be some people in jail right now. But instead, we all think, oh, the Fed, aren't they wise people? Let's, continue it and let them have more power. I think that's ridiculous. Its track record has been appalling. So I hope we go back to a gold standard, but I don't think its prospects are imminent, to say the least. Politicians don't like gold because they can't print it.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Larry. Thank you. That was very articulate and systematic and interesting analysis of the Great Description. Very, very captivating. Thank you. There was a question that was asked related to the current crisis and its comparison with Great Depression. I would like to clarify a little bit on that, seeking your clarification. The current unemployment level is soaring high. And that kind of echoes with what was happening in the Great Depression. As you know, in the US, I think it's come down to 13 to 14%. There is arguable data on that. But this kind of will, if to rectify that, you said the economy will generally ease with the lockdown going down, and then it'll slowly resume. But, the outcome, the product, that has a lag period. The production takes time. The unemployment has gone up very high. And in the meanwhile, the liquidity trap may happen, wherein the expansionary policies, the government trying to reduce rates, increase loans, but the business might not be active in production due to the expectations, negative expectations and fears. Don't you think this might spiral into deflation and sort of a vicious cycle similar to the Depression?
Good question. I wouldn't rule that out as a possibility. In fact, if we had, let's say, right now, a very interventionist administration that was seeking to dramatically raise taxes, as Roosevelt did, if the administration was trying to impose massive new costly regulations on the economy, if it was dramatically raising tariffs on foreign goods, choking off trade. And we do have a little bit of that. But if it was much more dramatic, if all those things were happening now at the same time, I think you would produce the situation you've just described. You'd have a combination of what economist and historian Robert Higgs called regime uncertainty, and this terrible monetary policy, causing business people to say, gee, I just don't have confidence anymore to invest. It's too risky. If I make a few bucks, they're going to tax or regulate me out of business. They're closing off my foreign markets. But we don't have that situation at the moment. So that's why I think we're more likely to see economic recovery for some period. I don't know how long, how many months or even a year or two. But I don't think what you've just described is on the horizon, because we don't at the moment have a massive tax hiking, tariff hiking, regulation boosting administration that would choke off confidence and investment.
Right. Thank you, Larry. Thank you.
Thank you.
Hi.
Hi.
Yeah, thanks for doing this. So I have a very simple question compared to the last one.
Yes.
What do you think of the book Radical Markets, if you came across it?
Radical what?
Radical Markets by Eric Posner and Glenn Weil.
Oh, I have not read it. So unfortunately, I'm not able to comment on it.
All right, cool. Thanks.
I'm sorry. I've been so focused in the last few months on some writing I've had to do and research for it that I've fallen a little bit behind in some of my current reading.
Cool. Thank you.
So the next question was about, sorry if it's not getting too late, just
No,
two or
that's all
three
right.
more questions, if it's possible. You were discussing about shutting down imports is similar to shutting down exports. It will in no time lead to shutting down exports. In which case, currently the Indian government has been adopting a policy called self-reliant economy, which I see more or less similar to import substitution or shutting down our imports and production by our own. Similar to that, we have seen US protectionist tendencies as well as European protectionist tendencies. Can you bit elaborate on it?
Yes.
And also the pro-exit China policy that is being adopted by various countries and companies.
Exchange rate controls?
Exit China policy.
Oh, exit. Okay. Well, I put all of that in the basket we call protectionism of one kind or another. It takes many forms, the tariff being the primary means, but everything from exit policies to quotas to regulations imposed on foreigners, but not, all sorts of forms that it takes, non-tariff barriers and so forth. All of that tends to pull people apart. It prevents people from employing their labor, their capital, their resources in the most productive directions. It may benefit certain sectors or companies, but that's not the same as saying that it's beneficial for the economy as a whole. That's for the same reason that if I go rob a bank and take the money to the local shopping mall and spend it there, you might say, oh, all the shopkeepers at the mall seem to think they got a stimulus. They like that. They hope you'll come back. But that's not the same as saying that by robbing the bank and spending it at the mall that I've helped the economy as a whole. I've simply redistributed wealth and made it more risky for people to make new investments. So the rise of protectionist sentiment and policies around the world troubles me very much. We made so much progress over the decades in bringing tariff barriers down from the heights that they reached in the 1930s, that we're sacrificing some of that gain. And so often it's just because of a noisy special interest who says, help me, punish my competition, make consumers buy from me instead of the other guy. That doesn't end well. So I may have gotten a little off track there, Thaja, but I hope I answered the question. I don't think that protectionism in any form is a long-term, wise, sustainable, productive policy.
Yeah, it's been on rise in India as well. Similar to the Maoist tendencies. Now, one of the states in India started to tell farmers which crops you should grow and which crops you should not grow. This is the kind of thing that's happening.
Yeah, I think instead of, there's a tendency for people who would oppose that to simply say in a very logical and rational, even-tempered way that here's why economically that doesn't make sense. But I think we should add another ingredient to our arguments against those kinds of policies. We should be saying to those politicians, this is preposterous. What, are you idiots? Well, you don't know the first thing about, why don't you go into the business and produce something instead of imposing your whims upon other people who are laboring and taking risks and employing people? What gives you the knowledge, let alone the right, to tell other people what they can produce or what price they can ask for what essentially is theirs? I mean, we need to morally challenge these preposterous edicts and mandates from politicians who so love to throw their power around. Don't let it be answered solely by green eye shades, bottom line accounting or economics. Go after them from a moral standpoint. Tell them to get out of your pocket, off your back and out of your way. I can tell you like that answer, Thaja.
Yeah. So any other questions from the participants?
I have one more question, Tejan.
Yes.
Sir, how we can utilize or how we can use this depression for the developing countries? How can developing countries can use this opportunity?
Okay, that's a good question. Boy, and that's one that I'll bet I could answer better after about an hour of thinking of it, but I'll do my best. I think developing countries should look at all these crazy counterproductive central planning type interventions that the rest of us are doing and say, we don't want that. Let's find ways to inspire the entrepreneur in our own country. Even if a foreign country, a big one like the United States, makes it difficult for us because it puts tariffs on our goods or does other bad things, we can still make the best of a situation by unleashing, unshackling our own entrepreneurs. Time and again, when you look at underdeveloped countries, you find that it isn't so much what other developed countries are doing to them that are keeping them in poverty. It's what they're doing to themselves. It's like in Africa, so often it's the tariffs that African countries put on fellow African countries that prevent a lot of their own domestic entrepreneurs from prospering. I don't know if this is true today, but I remember for years being able to cite that I think Kenya had tariffs on coffee from like Ethiopia or other countries in Africa that were so high, it made more sense for Kenyans to buy their coffee from Britain, who had to buy it first from Africa, send it to Britain, and then sell it to Kenya. But of course, by that time, it's sky high in price. So underdeveloped countries, I think, should look to how those of us who are developed first became so. How did we didn't become developed in America because we did all those stupid things that Roosevelt did in the 30s, or a lot of the dumb things we're doing today. We went from being a backwards 95% farmer economy to a wealthy one, largely because we unshackled the entrepreneur. We basically said we'll provide rule of law, protection of property rights, and otherwise it's a market free enough for you to take a risk and create wealth and go to town. That's the lesson I think developed countries should take from us. So the most important lessons we have to offer are more from our past, I think, in America than from what we're doing today.
So here, reverse innovation will help us, right?
What's that?
So reverse innovation will help to develop the developing country. Reverse innovation.
Oh, innovation, absolutely. Yeah, innovation. Find ways to do things better and cheaper and serve more customers. That's always been the best formula for individual success and therefore for national success. You allow the individual to be that innovative entrepreneur that we have in most of us. We just need to be unshackled and free to do it, free to make mistakes, free to go where our hearts and our capital and our labor and our wishes would take us when we have the freedom to act.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
So thanks, Larry. I think we covered most of the questions from the participants.
Thank you,
And
Teja.
thanks for your time.
May I just close with a few words?
Yes, yes, please.
Okay, I just want to say again, thank you to you for being persistent in making this happen. Again, my apologies that yesterday we had connection problems. I think today went well. Thanks to all the people who tuned in. I hope I gave you some food for thought. I hope you'll visit the FEE website, fee.org. Visit my website, lawrencewreed.com, the Facebook page as well. And thanks for whatever all of you may be doing on behalf of things like the entrepreneur and freedom of enterprise and personal liberties. Those are so important. And one of these days, I'll be able to come to India and thank you for that good work in person. Thank you.